March, let me know when it's ready. Perfect. Okay, awesome. All right. Good evening, y'all. It's great to see y'all here once again. So we're going to go and continue on with our studies. Today we're going to be in 1 Kings chapter 18. Hopefully the laptop doesn't die on me today and we'll be able to have the PowerPoint the whole way through. So quick recap of the last couple chapters. We went over chapter 16 a few weeks ago. We went over chapter 17 last week. We talked a bit about the history of Israel with the split after King Solomon and how the northern kingdom had many issues. There was a lot of strife and civil war that occurred due to them not following God, whereas the southern kingdom, despite them not being perfect, there were some kings that made attempts to follow God. So as a result, they had, generally speaking, more stability, more peace in their land. Right now in 1 Kings chapter 18, this is continuing off where we were reading last time. We were talking about Elijah and some of the things that occurred with him, how he was taken care of by God after he commanded the drought on the land. He was taken care of by that creek by God, and then after that, God had him go to the widow's house and help her and her son, bring her son back from the dead through the power of God. And from that point, God once again sends him. And here in chapter 18, he is sent to confront Ahab. The speaker who I was inspired to get this lesson from, he had a title for this. I believe it was called the Confrontation of Yahweh, which we'll read more about as we read through this. So 1 Kings chapter 8. Right now, I'm going to start off reading verses 1 through 16. 1 Kings chapter 18, verses 1 through 16, as it reads. And after many days, the word of the Lord came to Elijah in the 3rd year, saying, Go, show yourself to Ahab, and I will send rain upon the earth. So Elijah went to show himself to Ahab. Now the famine was severe in Samaria, and Ahab called Obadiah, who was over the household. Now Obadiah feared the Lord greatly, and when Jezebel cut off the prophets of the Lord, Obadiah took 100 prophets and hid them by 50s in a cave, and fed them with bread and water. And Ahab said to Obadiah, Go through the land to all the springs of water and to all the valleys. Perhaps we may find grass and save the horses and mules alive, and not lose some of the animals. So they divided the land between them to pass through it. Ahab went in one direction by himself, and Obadiah went in another direction by himself. And as Obadiah was on his way, Elijah met him. And Obadiah recognized him and fell on his face and said, Is it you, my lord Elijah? And he answered him, It is I. Go, tell your lord, behold, Elijah is here. And he said, Obadiah speaking, How have I sinned that you would give your servant into the hand of Ahab to kill me? As the Lord your God lives, there is no nation or kingdom where my Lord has not sent to seek you. And when they would say, He is not here, he would take an oath of the kingdom or nation that they had not found you. And now you say, Go tell your Lord, behold, Elijah is here. And as soon as I have gone from you, the Spirit of the Lord will carry you, I know not where. And so, when I come and tell Ahab, and he cannot find you, he will kill me, although I, your servant, have feared the Lord from my youth. Has it not been told, my Lord, what I did when Jezebel killed the prophets of the Lord, how I hid 100 men of the Lord's prophets by 50s in a cave and fed them with bread and water? And now you say, Go tell your Lord, behold, Elijah is here, and he will kill me. And Elijah said, As the Lord of hosts lives, before whom I stand, I will surely show myself to him today. So Obadiah went to meet Ahab and told him, and Ahab went to meet Elijah. So there's a few pointers that I want to go through in this section. The first pointer that we see here is obviously the extremities of the famine. The famine had been going on for a couple years at this point. We read a bit about it back in chapter 17. And we see it got to the point where the king had to take matters into his own hand. Often, whenever we talk about royalties and those in charge, we often make jokes that, they don't do much. They just tell people to do stuff and others go do it for them. But Ahab decided, this is getting so bad, I have to go out there with my men and we have to go collect these animals to be able to what's the term? To make storage, to be able to plan things ahead. He could no longer trust his men to just do it on their own. He had to get his hands dirty too. So him and one of his most trusted men, Obadiah, who, based on from what we understand here, had a very high level of authority. Talking about having, in verse, where is it? Verse Verse 3, how he was over the household. It could be argued that Obadiah was one of the top 5 most powerful people in the kingdom of Israel, maybe even the second most powerful after King Ahab. And we see here that these 2 men, they made themselves in charge of finding the food to be able to ration among the people. That was the word that I was looking for. One of the great things that we see here is that Obadiah, while King Ahab was a very evil and unfaithful man, Obadiah was actually very faithful. How he served the Lord since his youth, we read a bit about here, and how he illegally protected the servants of the Lord. After many prophets were being persecuted by Queen Jezebel, we read how he hid about 100 of them and stored them away in caves and actually took care of them because he cared about the Lord. He wanted to do what was right and protect the Lord's people. So we see that here in these verses. One thing that we also read here is about Obadiah's fear of persecution, that he's worried over his own life. After all, as we read through there, Elijah tells him, I am here. I tell your king that I need to speak with him. And Obadiah is immediately concerned for his life. He makes pleas. He's worried that if I tell him, and I know the Lord has the power to make you disappear, I know the Lord will protect you, Elijah. Will the Lord protect me? Will Ahab think I'm a liar? Will Ahab think I'm conspiring against him? Will he kill me? And he pleads how much work he's done for the Lord, how in these times, how he's tried to protect the prophets of the Lord. However, in his worries, Elijah makes a promise to him, and Elijah tells him, I will meet the Lord. I will meet your king Ahab. I will not leave. I will not disappear. Just do as I command of you, and I will speak with him. One thing that really I'll talk a little about later is how he talks about how no matter what, he will meet King Ahab. That's his goal, and right now he's asking Obadiah to bring him to Ahab, but if Obadiah won't do that, Elijah will find a way to meet Ahab regardless. So we're going to go ahead and read through the next part, reading through verses 17 through 24. If y'all have any interjections you wish to make, just raise your hand, by all means. I would appreciate that. So verse 17 as it reads, When Ahab saw Elijah, Ahab said to him, Is it you, you troubler of Israel? And he answered, I have not troubled Israel, but you have, and your father's house, because you have abandoned the commandments of the Lord and followed the Baals. Now therefore send and gather all Israel to me at Mount Carmel, and the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who eat at Jezebel's table. Verse 20. So Ahab said to all the people of Israel and gathered the prophets together at Mount Carmel. And Elijah came near to all the people and said, How long will you go limping between 2 different opinions? If the Lord is God, follow him. But if Baal, then follow him. And the people of the Lord did not answer him a word. Then Elijah said to the people, I, even I only, am left a prophet of the Lord, but Baal's prophet are 450 men. Let 2 bulls be given to us, and let them choose 1 bull for themselves, and cut it in pieces, and lay it on the wood, but put no fire on it. Put fire to it. And I will prepare the other bull, and lay it on the wood, and put no fire to it. And you call upon the name of your God, and I will call upon the name of the Lord, and the God who answers by fire, he is God. And all the people answered, It is well spoken. So here, there's a few. Give me a second. I didn't scroll through my notes right here. We see a couple things occur. First, Elijah meets with Ahab in verses 17 through 19. And automatically we see Ahab blames the famine on Elijah. And at first glance, we can see where Ahab might come from in the sense that Ahab was the one who said there would be no water touching the land. We read that in verse 17 last week, chapter 17 last week. However, as Elijah rightfully points out, this it wasn't simply Elijah was making a drought over land because he felt like it, but rather it was a punishment for the people of Israel. They chose not to follow the Lord their God. How Ahab and his family chose to distance themselves from God. They decided to do their own thing. I know we talked about it a bit last week, how Israel had stopped following God for decades at this point, if not well over 100 years since the time of King David. Many years had passed, and they had been unfaithful for all this time. They had propped up kings who did not choose to follow God. So as a result, God, through the power of God through Elijah, a drought was brought onto the land, and the people suffered for it. King Ahab suffered for it. And then from there, we see that Elijah comes up with a proposal. I put democratic in the sense that, the people were allowed to see for themselves and be able to make that decision for themselves. Elijah wanted this test, this test that was to occur. He wanted everyone to see it. It wasn't going to be a hidden thing that only King Ahab would see. Sometimes we read through the Bible when we read events of miracles that occur with God. Off the top of my head, I think of when Moses met with Pharaoh, when he wanted to free his people, and how he showed miracles by turning the staff into a snake. All the people didn't see that. That was just between Pharaoh and Moses, and a few of the people that were in the palace at the time. That was one of those times where God wanted that miracle to be seen privately. But in this instance, Elijah and God wanted this miracle that we're going to read about later. He wanted all the people to see, all the people of the land, all the Israelites and all the prophets that Baal had and such, the false prophets. And he wanted to give this test so that then the people could see the true power of God. Continuing forward, this next section I call the testing of faith. It's going to be verses 25 through 40. As it reads, verse 25. Then Elijah said to the prophets of Baal, "Choose for yourselves one bull and prepare it first, for you are many, and call upon the name of your God, but put no fire to it." And they took the bull that was given them, and they prepared it and called upon the name of Baal from morning until noon, saying, "O Baal, answer us." But there was no voice, and no one answered. And they limped around the altar that they had made. And at noon Elijah mocked them, saying, "Cry aloud, for he is a god. Either he is musing, or he is relieving himself, or he is on a journey, or perhaps he is asleep and must be awakened." And they cried out aloud and cut themselves after their customs with swords and lances until the blood gushed out upon them. And as midday passed, they raved on until the time of the offering of the oblation, but there was no voice. No one answered, no one paid attention. Verse 30. Then Elijah said to all the people, "Come near to me." And all the people came near to him. And he repaired the altar of the Lord that had been thrown down. Elijah took 12 stones, according to the number of the tribes of the sons of Jacob, to whom the word of the Lord came, saying, "Israel shall be your name." And with the stones he built an altar in the name of the Lord. And he made a trench about the altar, as great as would contain two seahs of seed. And he put the woods in order and cut the bull in pieces and laid it on the wood. And he said, "Fill 4 jars with water and pour it on the burnt offerings and on the woods." And he said, "Do it a second time." And then they did it a second time. And he said, "Do it a third time." And they did it a third time. And the water ran around the altar and filled the trench also with water. Verse 36. And at the time of the offering of the oblation, Elijah the prophet came near and said, "O Lord, God of Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, let it be known this day that you are God in Israel, and that I am your servant, and that I have done all these things at your word. Answer me, O Lord, answer me, that this people may know that you, O Lord, are God, and that you have turned their hearts back." Then the fire of the Lord fell and consumed the burnt offerings and the wood and the stones and the dust, and licked up the water that was in the trench. And when all the people saw it, they fell on their faces and said, "The Lord, he is God, the Lord, he is God." And Elijah said to them, "Seize the prophets of Baal, let not one of them escape." And they seized them. And Elijah brought them back to the brook Kishon and slaughtered them there. So a lot occurs here, and we see this great miracle that occurs, that Elijah gathers the prophets of Baal for this big showdown, this big test to occur for both of them to prove their gods. And as we read through here, the prophets of Baal were false prophets. Nothing occurred. No god of theirs came to accept their offering because Baal never existed. However, we see in this case how Elijah's offering, was honest, was true, and he was presenting it to the true God, the God Yahweh, the God of the Israelites. And as a result, despite I put here talking about how the odds were stacked against him, against Elijah, God still answered him and showed his power and showed his might to the people of Israel. Put here how the attempts of the prophets of Baal were in vain, how it got to the point that they had been doing it for hours, and it was for so long, they started injuring themselves, where it talks about how their blood was seeping on the floor. I wouldn't be surprised if some of those prophets ended up harming themselves to the point of death, due to them believing so much that their God would serve them, that their God would appear for them and light this fire. It got to the point where Elijah started mocking him, making fun of them. Elijah had this level of confidence in him, knowing what they were doing was but in vain. However, in Elijah's case, the odds, he decided to stack them against him. First off, he allowed the prophets of Baal to go first, essentially making it more likely that if theirs were true, if they had if their God was real, if they got to go first, that would automatically invalidate Elijah. So if they got it right, going first, Elijah would be wrong. They would be able to kill Elijah. So they had the odds stacked in their favor in that way. But also, they had all the people, they had all their prophets to prepare it, to do all their chanting and such, all their rituals, and yet nothing occurred. What they also had as an advantage was that their sacrifice occurred during the day, during the morning and day, when the sun was out, when the wood and the meat was dry, meaning that it was more likely for it to catch on fire. However, in Elijah's case, since he went afterwards, he did a few things. We read how, one, he set up the stones in such a way where he had 12 stones as a way to remind the people, remember your past, remember that we are the 12 tribes of Israel, remember our history where we descended from as the Jewish people, not people of Baal or Asherah, but rather people of Yahweh, the Lord's people. By setting it more in the evening time, kind of think about it how it is today, how, usually in the daytime it's very dry, it's very hot outside. So theoretically speaking, stuff is more likely to catch on fire. However, in the evenings, stuff like that is less likely to occur. And, we read directly here how water was poured over the altar, over the rocks and the meat. So it was very wet. This was a bit later in the day, so it was less hot outside. So the chance for it to catch on fire was next to nothing. However, despite him stacking the odds against himself purposefully, the power of God was displayed to all. And we see how the impossible was made reality. How he prayed to the Lord, he had confidence in the Lord, and the Lord answered his prayers. The Lord answered him and struck down the altar and lit this large fire. It reads how the stones had broken from the lightning and the fire, and how the water had just evaporated into the air very fast. And I don't know about y'all, but rocks are pretty hard, so for them to be able to break, that must mean it was a powerful force. This was a powerful force shown by God to absolutely display his might, so that all the Israelites, all the prophets of Baal, and King Ahab would see this. And finally, we read at the end that there was a punishment for the false prophets, the ones who had been guiding the people of Israel away from the Lord. The people of Israel did make the decision to follow the prophets of Baal, to follow the prophets of Asherah. However, these evil men, these false prophets, they were the ones who led them there. So as a result, God did not have mercy for them. They were so confident in their beliefs. They led this nation astray, and as a result, after this event, Elijah punished them and slaughtered them, as it reads there. A very powerful display that we see in this event. And finally, finishing off the chapter, we're going to read through verses 41 through 46, as it reads. And Elijah said to Ahab, "Go up, eat and drink, for there is a sound of the rushing of rain." So Ahab went up to eat and to drink, and Elijah went up to the top of the Mount Carmel, and he bowed himself down on the earth and put his face between his knees. And he said to his servants, "Go up now, look towards the sea." And he went up and looked and said, "There is nothing." And he said, "Go again 7 times. And at the 7th time he said, "Behold, a little cloud like a man's hand is rising from the sea." And he said, "Go up, say to Ahab, prepare your chariot and go down, lest the rain stop you." And in a little while the heavens grew black, and the clouds grew black with clouds and wind, there was a great rain. And Ahab rode and went to Jezreel, and the hand of the Lord was on Elijah, and he gathered up his garments and ran before Ahab to the entrance of Jezreel. So finally, ending off the chapter, one thing we see once again is the confidence of Elijah. This day was probably one of the, if we're thinking about the mind of Elijah, this was probably like one of the best days of his life. For years before this, he was living by a creek, just trying to make ends meet, just getting food, getting water, barely making it by. And then he had to live with the widow, and, he had to trust the Lord, not only that she would be able to eat for the rest of the famine, but also he had to trust that the Lord would be able to bring her son back from the dead. So, so for many years, he was living a very meager life, nothing that someone would call lavish, just trying to make his ends meet, live day by day. But finally, with his patience and with his trust in the Lord, finally, he was able to display the power of God through this event, through this showdown between the prophets of Baal and Elijah, and how he was able to prove that for all the people of Israel to see that the prophets that they followed, that God, Baal, that he was a false god, that there was no truth to that, but rather that they got to see that the true God, the God of their people, the God of Israel, he was the true God, and that they needed to follow him. And we read how in verse 39, verse 30, where am I? Yeah, verse 39, how they realized, how they repented that the Lord, he is God, the Lord, he is God, as it reads. They recognized their wrongdoings, and there was this great joy, this level, like I said, this confidence that he had in him, because everything was going right. Why? Because he trusted God. And here in verse 41, how he has also a love of confidence, saying there is something that is coming. He knows what it is. Spoiler, the title is right here. On this slide, he knew that the rain was to come, and we read in verse 42 how he prayed to the Lord, to bring back the rain. He was through the Lord, Elijah was able to take away the rain from the land, and now after all of this occurred, through the power of the Lord, the rain was able to come back. Elijah was able to pray for that once again. And that brought, as a result, an end to the famine. And finally, this kind of comes as it's a little bit funny to me, the miraculous empowerment that we see at the end. I'm talking about how Elijah, he had this level of confidence, this day was going so well for him, and yet in the case of Ahab, this day was going poorly. He wanted to get rid of Elijah. He hated him. He caused this famine to occur, this drought to occur, and then finally, Elijah says, "Wait, let's do this test." He had the odds stacked against him. I'm sure Ahab had a level of confidence that, Elijah's going to fail, we'll be able to kill him, get rid of him, the people will be okay with that. However, everything went wrong for King Ahab that day. He lost all his prophets. The people turned back to the Lord. The rain came back, of course, but the people saw it wasn't because of Ahab and his side, but rather because of God and Elijah. And at the end, to finally send like a little, I guess, a last thing for Ahab, the final display of power was given to Elijah when Elijah was able to outrun King Ahab and his chariots. I'm sure y'all have seen how fast horses can run, and the chariots they carry behind them, those things can easily go upwards of 30, 40, 50 miles an hour, especially going downhill, and yet through the power of God, Elijah was able to go faster than that. A miracle was able to occur because of that. And it's a great thing to see. So that concludes the chapter that we read through right now. Right now we're going to go ahead and go through the gleanings of the text. Is there anything that y'all want to bring up from this chapter? Anything that stood out to y'all? No? Okay. So the first point that I want to go through... Mm-hmm.
I think Elijah is a really good example of not giving up even when he takes it all the way to the end.
Mm-hmm.
He traveled with
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
This is a good example for us that when those problems come along in our life, we don't give up. We
Mm-hmm.
keep trusting God, even when everybody else around you says, hey, it's not going to work out.
Mm-hmm. That's a great point. Just going back to the last chapter and going through this chapter, we see when Elijah, which one of the points that I'll talk about, when Elijah trusted in the Lord, things went well. In this chapter, when he trusted that the Lord would show up at this confrontation, at this showdown, things went well. The Lord was with him. When Elijah trusted that the Lord would bring back the rain, the rain came back. Going back to chapter 17, when Elijah trusted in the Lord was able to take care of him by the creek. When Elijah trusted in the Lord, he was able to bring the widow's son back to life. And it's when he trusts the Lord, those things go right. So that's a very great point that you brought up. Thank you, Andy. One of the points that I did want to bring up from this chapter, starting off with, is the right man at the right place and at the right time. We see, if you rereading verses 3 and 4, it talks about how Obadiah, how he was able to save 100 prophets. During this time, the prophets of the Lord were being persecuted due to Elijah's drought on the land. But because Obadiah had influence and power, he was able to save at least 100 of them and take care of them. I know when I was going through this, the first thing that came to my mind was when a few weeks back, when your brother, when he had his lesson, how he brought up the Schindler's List and how Oskar Schindler, how he was able to protect many of the Jewish people during the Holocaust. Because he had that influence in the Nazi party, he was able to hire many of them to work under him, and as a result, their lives were saved. It's a very similar situation. And the truth is, as Christians, we're always in the right place at the right time, to spread the gospel, to serve the Lord. The question is, are we being the right man or the right woman? Are we choosing to follow the Lord? We're always going to find souls that need the Lord. We're always going to be at the right place and at the right time. The question is if we're the right man for that. The second point that really stood out to me and kind of put a bit of fear in me was verse 15, how the Lord's will is absolute. Reading right before this, it was Elijah when he was talking to Obadiah, and he told Obadiah, tell Ahab that I wish to speak with him. And immediately Obadiah feared for his life. It talks about that he thinks that the Lord is punishing him, and he immediately tries to make pleas by saying, I know that if I go tell him and I come back and you're not here, King Ahab is going to kill me because he's going to think I lied to him. And Obadiah talks about, I've served the Lord, I've protected all these people. Obadiah is worried, so he's hesitant to do that. He's hesitant to go tell King Ahab that Elijah wishes to speak to him. And verse 15 is very powerful because when you read it, it can first be read as a promise. Elijah is telling Obadiah, don't worry, everything's going to go good, you're going to be safe, Obadiah, don't worry about it. But rereading it again, I just want to reread through verse 15 once more. And Elijah said, as the Lord of hosts live, before whom I stand, I will surely show myself to him today. Like I said, the one way you can read it is by him, promising to Obadiah, I'm not going to disappear, I'm not going to run away, I wish to speak with Ahab. But another way you can read it is that Elijah's almost making a threat to him by saying, if you don't bring me to Ahab, if you don't tell Ahab that I'm here, I'm going to meet him regardless. And because you decided to defy the will of the Lord and what I need to do, consequences may occur for you, Obadiah. And that's something that's honestly a little scary. But what I mean by this is that Elijah at this point was a faithful servant of the Lord. Him and God, they already had a plan of what they were going to go through today. None of this chapter was spontaneous. Elijah had everything premeditated and pre-planned. At the end, he was going to meet Ahab. He was going to have this test no matter what. And first off, he wanted Obadiah to work with him. He wanted Obadiah to see that the Lord recognizes Obadiah's work and that he's proud of what Obadiah is doing. But also that if Obadiah chooses not to comply with Elijah and the Lord, that Obadiah may be punished for it. How I like to think how no matter what, God's will is going to go through. The question is whether or not we're going to serve it. Off the top of my mind, I thought about this earlier. Going back to the idea of Paul, we often talk about how Paul was the apostle for the Gentiles. How he was commanded to go and preach to the Gentiles in Europe and Asia Minor and such. That was his role as an apostle for the Lord, but Paul could have said no. Paul could have been, no, I don't want to do that. I want to stay in Israel. I want to preach to the Jewish people. I like that. God could have said, okay, fine, but I'm still going to find someone to do it. And he could have possibly punished Paul for that. Obviously that didn't occur. Paul served the Lord. He went to go preach to the Gentiles. And we know him for that today. But the Lord, he would have had someone else ready to do that. So the question we have to ask ourselves, are we going to do the will of the Lord? Are we still going to do what he asks us? Because we can choose to say no. He's going to find someone else to do it. But, that's not going to put you in good favor with the Lord. So that's something that we need to recognize too. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's a perfect example because, Saul chose to reject God. When you said Saul, I was thinking Paul, so that's why I got a little confused. It's okay. When King Saul, chose not to follow God, like you said, he said, fine, I'll find someone who will, and that was David. And, as a result, King Saul line ended and the dynasty of King David began. Very great point there. The next point that I wanted to go through is about challenging false beliefs. How, like I said, Elijah from the beginning, he already had this whole thing planned out. But yet he could have simply just said, I'm going to bring back the water to the land. I'm going to end this drought. But he wanted to make an example. He wanted the people to see that the Lord has this power over the land, not Baal, not Asherah. A perfect verse to go to is Ephesians chapter 6, verse 12. I'm going to turn there right now real fast. Ephesians 6, verse 12. I'm sure some of y'all already have this one memorized. Unfortunately, I do not. 6:12. Perfect. Right here, as it reads, for we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. Reading there how our work as followers of the Lord, nowadays as Christians at this time, as the prophets of the Lord, how they needed not only was Elijah fighting against King Ahab, not only was that his enemy, but also it was the ideas of these false gods of Baal, of Asherah. Not only did he want to, not only was Elijah against Ahab, but he was against those ideas. And through this work, he wanted to challenge those false beliefs. And that's why he had it, so that the people of Israel would see that. The people of Israel could be able to say, on that day, I saw that Baal and Asherah were proven to be false gods, and the Lord Jehovah was proven to be a real God, the Lord Yahweh. So that's a very important thing for us to understand. Are we trying to challenge false beliefs? Maybe we're not, setting up these big showdowns that Elijah had against the prophets of Baal. But are we talking to people about the Lord? Are we studying for ourselves, fortifying our own faith, or do we still have doubts, even if we've been Christians for many years? That's something that we need to resolve with ourselves every day. A couple other last couple gleanings that I had from the text before we wrap up. Like I was talking about, we read about the confidence of Elijah throughout this whole book, how he was confident that he was going to meet King Ahab. He was confident about the showdown going down, and that, he was so confident that he made the odds stacked against himself. And he was so confident that the rain was going to come back, and he was confident that the Lord would protect him and allow him to beat Ahab down the hill. And all of that, the reason why he had that confidence was because he trusted God. I put verses 36 and 37 there, how he prays to God in that moment, praying to him, allow your glory to be shown. And that's something that we get to have too. We get to have that confidence in God. I know sometimes confidence can be viewed a bit as a negative thing, because confidence can lead to arrogance sometimes. But often it's when that confidence is from oneself. When I start becoming confident in myself, it's easy for me to become prideful. It's easy for me to become arrogant. But when I'm confident in the Lord, like Elijah, I can do great things. And that's what we need to understand. I just remembered right now, I don't remember the verse off the top of my head, how Paul talks about, if one of y'all is able to get it, that'd be amazing. He talks about, what do I boast? But I boast in the Lord. I'm sure y'all know which verse I'm talking about. I just don't remember off the top of my head. I wish I wrote it down here. But how, the Bible tells us, that we can be confident in the Lord because through him great things can occur. And the final point that I wish that I got out of this was the mercy of God. How, like I said, the people were suffering for quite a few years due to this drought that resulted in a famine, and yet this showdown occurred, and because they saw the Lord, they repented, they confessed, the Lord, He is God, the Lord, He is God, and as a result, God had mercy on them. He could have, just like the prophets of Baal, he could have struck them down, he could have wiped them out, but he gave them a second chance. So not only, did he not punish them, but he also gave them back the rain. And also another person that he gave a second chance to was Ahab. Ahab could have been punished that same day, and yet Elijah and the Lord, they chose not to punish Ahab that day. They gave him a second chance, just like the rest of the people. And I mean, honestly, there's only at this point, reading it, can only infer so much. But personally, I like to believe it's because God had some belief in Ahab. Honestly, spoiler alert, like reading through this, I think Ahab has really become such a fascinating character to me. I can't really talk about it yet until we get to the later chapters, but just talking a little bit about it, I know people talk about how King Ahab was one of the most evil kings, and I think there is good evidence of that. However, Ahab, I think, was to a certain degree conflicted. I think he did have some belief in the Lord. He did have some respect for Elijah, even though he viewed Elijah as his enemy. Ahab was evil in many ways, but as we read through it, we'll also see that maybe there was a bit of doubt in the beliefs of Asherah and the beliefs of Baal. That maybe there was like a hint of like a hint that maybe he could have believed that the Lord was the true God. Spoiler, I know some of y'all know, he doesn't change. Yes, Andy?
Do you think they had to be a good example to be careful about being right?
Absolutely. That's a great point. We'll read more about Jezebel and how she was an evil influence on him. And definitely, had he not chosen to marry her, things could have turned differently. Or maybe he still would have been evil. But regardless, this is an opinion of mine, but I do think, that day Ahab might have not repented, but possibly had a heart like slowly opening to believe God. Spoiler alert: he goes back to Jezebel, and that part closes. But the Lord still granted him mercy that day. He didn't grant mercy to the prophets of Baal because they were confident in that belief. They prophesied. They turned away the people of the Lord, so God and Elijah punished those prophets that day, but he gave Ahab and he gave the people of Israel a second chance. He allowed them to have their reign back, and he chose not to strike them down that day. With that, I conclude my lesson, and that's a great place to end off the chapter. Is there any comments anyone wishes to make, any corrections in case I messed up something, any questions? No? Alrighty then. Well, I thank you for your time. I'll go and end off in a quick prayer.